And thank you, veterans out there, and everybody else who has done your part to keep America free. I understand that you veterans out there all have interesting stories to tell. And so I'm kind of flattered to have been asked to share my experience in World War II with you. I'm going to just try to give an overview of one part of that, the part when I became a prisoner of war in Germany. And expect that you might have questions that would bring out more detail if you're interested in more detail. I was a navigator in B-17s in World War II. And on June the 28th, 1944, my crew took off from the United States for a combat group, assignment in a combat group in Foggia, Italy. And 9 days after that takeoff, I was a prisoner of war. And 5 of those days were spent in flying from the United States to Foggia. So 4 days after I arrived in Foggia, I was put up on my first combat mission with a crew that I never saw before. And we were to destroy some oil refineries in northeast Germany. And about 2 hours into the flight, it was a long mission, and about 2 hours into the flight, we were attacked by enemy fighters, and they made 2 passes at us, and before we knew it, our engines were in trouble. One of them was streaming smoke, and the other one was sputtering. The pilot said, we can't make it on 2 engines. He fed the 2 engines that were in trouble, and he said, we can't make it to the target on 2 engines. He said, I'm turning around. He said, the bombardier, jettison the bombs, and to the rest of us, throw everything you can out of the plane. And so when we turned around, we were told that we had friendly fighter cover from above on the way back. But about 30 minutes into the return trip, we had dropped from 25,000 feet to 10,000 feet, and we were over German-occupied Austria when a 3rd engine went out. And the pilot fed up that one. He said, we're not going to make it home on 1 engine. He said, we're going to have to bail out. I'll see you in the States. And with that, the bombardier and I went back to the waist where the 6 enlisted men were already bailing out. And I was the 7th man out, and the bombardier was the 8th man out. The pilot and co-pilot stayed on with the plane for a while. But we understood that they did jump, and they crashed the plane into some foothills. But the 8 of us who bailed out of the waist were all captured. And surprisingly not shot. I say surprisingly because we could hear them firing at us as we were coming down in our parachutes. Well, after 3 weeks of processing and interrogation and marching and being transported, we were sent to a permanent prison camp, and the bombardier and I were sent to a camp at the northernmost tip of Germany, right across the Baltic from Sweden. And the camp was originally meant for captured flying officers only. When we arrived there were about 6,000 prisoners. And when we left about 9 months later, there were over 9,000 prisoners in that camp. But the camp was divided into 4 compounds that were separated by high-wired fences, one from the other. And I was sent to a compound called North 2 7 barracks in it, and a utility building. The utility building was a source of water for us and a latrine. And each of the barracks was divided into 10 compartments that held 20 men each. So there were 200 men in the barracks and 7 barracks. There were 1,400 men in our compound alone. The men ate and slept and spent most of the day in their compartments. We did fall out for head count twice a day, once in the morning at 8 o'clock and once in the afternoon at 4 o'clock. But I've often been asked, were the Germans mean to you? Did they abuse you? How did they treat you? And the answer to that is they weren't abusive. But if we stepped out of line, they could be very harsh in their response and their punishment for us. For example, during the air raids, the prisoners were supposed to stay in the barracks. And on occasion, the air raids were very long. And 2 of the prisoners at different times stepped outside the barracks. And when they got into the compound, they realized that the air raid was still on. And they turned around to go back into the barracks. And in that process, they were shot and killed. Another example of the way the Germans responded was that the story of Colonel Spicer. Colonel Spicer was the highest ranking prisoner in our compound, and therefore he was our compound commander. But one morning after head count, he said, the German commandant has asked me, or told me, to make an announcement to you. And the German commandant was standing right next to Spicer. And Spicer said, the commandant has said that an iron bar from the latrine door has been removed, and he wants it back. And he's concerned that the bar will be used as a weapon against his guards. And he says he wants it back before the afternoon head count. And if he doesn't get it back before the afternoon head count, he's going to cut off the coal to the whole camp. Spicer said, you know, that would be disastrous. He said, you have a right to try to escape, but not at the expense of all the rest of us. So please, if you're in possession of an iron bar, please return it before the afternoon head count. And so Spicer paused for a minute, and Dan tells me that I can't swear in church here, so I won't swear. But Spicer said, you know, these, and he cussed them out, said some pretty profane things about the Germans, and he said, they'll carry out their threat. They're just looking for excuses to be hard on us. So please don't give them an excuse. And the first time he cussed them out, somebody in the head count formation said, give him H. Spicer. I'm not swearing to him. Give him H. Spicer. And the second or third time that Spicer cussed him out, there was kind of a chorus of shouts to, you know, tell it like it is, Spicer. And I'm not using any of the profanity that Spicer used. But he said, they're just looking for excuses to put it to us. And about the fourth time he cussed them out, a whole chorus of people from the head count started shouting, and a ripple of applause went through the head count. And the German commandant just nodded to his guards, and they took Spicer away. Spicer was sentenced to be executed for exciting a riot of the prisoners. Fortunately, we were liberated before Spicer was executed. But those are examples of times when I think the Germans reacted rather harshly to times when the prisoners just, stepped out of line a little bit. I've often been asked too, did you guys have enough to eat? And of course the answer to that was no. We were operating on about 1,000 calories a day, and some of those calories were pretty lousy. For example, the bread that we were given each day was, by recipe, it was 20% sawdust and powdered leaves. And sometimes there were a lot of impurities in it. I mean, we found glass and horse droppings and everything else in the bread from time to time. I was never very fat, I was always thin, but I went into that camp at about 140 pounds and came out of it about 120 pounds, but bigger men lost a lot more weight than that. I've also been asked often, did you guys know what was going on in the world or with the war? And the Germans would never tell us. But the answer to the question is yes, we did. We were getting British broadcasting news almost every day. Somewhere in the camp, there was a radio hidden. And the Germans suspected that they could never find it. They searched the barracks several times and never found the radio. And I didn't know where it was. But what was fascinating about it is the way the news was disseminated to the rest of us prisoners who couldn't hear the radio. When the Germans would shutter us in at night, somebody in each of the barracks would come through the barracks with what we called our newspaper. It was just a normal sheet of paper with news from the British Broadcasting Group, but it was called POW. That's what we call our paper, POW, P-O-W. And it would give us the news of the previous day. So we knew where the battle lines were, and we knew what targets were bombed the day before. We had another source of news in our particular compartment. There was a bombardier who spoke fluent German, and he was the only one in the whole compound who was authorized to speak to the Germans and trade with the Germans. And very often we got information about what was happening in the other parts of the camp, and sometimes what was happening in Germany with the German people. But one day, he came back to the compartment with his chin at his knees, and reluctantly he told us that the German guard had told him that Hitler had put in a special order that all Allied airmen in the possession of the Germans should be executed. That meant us. And the reason for it was that because the way that the Allies bombed the city of Dresden, and it's my understanding that over a period of 3 days, the RAF and the USAF dropped 4,000 tons of incendiaries on that city. And when the people scampered to get away from the burning buildings, they were strafed. And the records showed that 25,000 German civilians were killed in those raids. And he also told us that the German guard told him how we were to be executed. And under the pretense of moving the camp, we were to be transported in boxcars and left in the marshalling yards to freeze to death. That year, Germany had the coldest winter that it had in 50 years. So that scared us, especially when about 4 days later, we got the order to put our things together and get ready for a move. And we prayed that that order to move would never come. Unfortunately, it didn't. And the story behind that is that the German Wehrmacht, the military officials, seeing the handwriting on the wall that Germany was going to lose the war, they defied Hitler's orders because they didn't want to be charged for war crimes after the war. I doubt that there was a prisoner in the camp who at one time or another didn't ask himself the question, why am I here? Why me? Not why poor me so much, because we all had friends or buddies or knew somebody who was killed in combat or who died in prison camp. One of my two members died in prison camp. But we can never figure out a pattern to the kind of person that ended up in a prison camp. And so we asked ourselves, why am I saved? Is there some purpose to this? And speaking of purpose, some of you may know of an Auschwitz prisoner named Viktor Frankl, who after the war became a well-known psychiatrist in Europe. He wrote the book called Man's Search for Meaning, and we were doing a lot of that, believe me. We could never figure out, and I never did figure out why I was saved. But his observation of the prisoners in Auschwitz was that, and he made a study of this, that the people who survived the best were the ones who could find purpose in their day. He noted that some prisoners helped other prisoners on a daily basis, and some even shared their meager rations with others that they thought needed it more. But anyway, they could find purpose to their day. He thought that those people were the ones that survived the best. But the ones who just went along day to day gradually deteriorated, and they were the best candidates for non-survival in the camp. And in a similar way, I found that true in my camp, that the guys who laid in the sack all day, they became the complainers. They became the people who just seemed to gradually get worse. And I'm speaking for myself now, because I know there are many different ways to get purpose to one's day. But I felt so lucky that it was there in prison camp that I realized more fully that if I had my senses and my faith, I could get purpose to my day. There was always somebody or some group or some cause that I could pray for. And if I believed, if I had the faith that my prayer was being heard, not necessarily granted, but heard, my day counted for something. And that idea carried over to my post-prisoner war days. That I think that no matter how I may be confined, whether it's in prison camp or in a nursing home or in a wheelchair or on a desert island, if I have my senses and my faith, my day will have purpose. And as Frankl said, having purpose is an important factor in survival. So on May the 1st, 1945, the Russians broke into our camp and liberated us. And 7 days later, on the 8th of May, the Germans surrendered. And about a week after that, we were flown out of our camp to a camp in France called Camp Lucky Strike. where we were debriefed and rehabilitated, fattened up, and sent home with a 60-day furlough, and also the instructions to get ready to be reassigned to the Pacific Theater to defeat the Japanese. So that's my abbreviated story, and I appreciate the fact that you all invited me to tell it. And I thank you for the invitation to your dinner, too.